South Africa feels massively volatile. We're seeing terrifying scenes. South Africa in the last 3 weeks has seen the consequences of fees must fall. Is it a sign of what's wrong not only with South Africa but with the world at large? The world, is it adapting fast enough to a change in demographics? And what does China's change of moving from an export-led to consumer-based economy really mean for commodity prices? All of this feeds, of course, into what is happening in South Africa. And then there's the small matter of an American election playing itself out in early November. This is The Moneymakers. I'm Bruce Whitfield. Tonight, very pleased to be joined by a former senior Harvard University fellow. He's taught at Yale. He's president of Keelan Advisors. And he is also the #1 rated analyst on LinkedIn. We don't just get anybody on The Moneymakers. We get Dr. Vikram Mancharamani onto The Moneymakers. You've been in South Africa for a couple of days. You've spoken to chartered financial analysts. You've got a very good helicopter view of the world. What are you telling us about the world that helps us reflect on ourselves?
Sure. So, Bruce, I think I would start with what's happened in China. We have had an investment-led bubble that has burst, and that is sending, through the commodity complex, deflationary pressures around the world. We've obviously seen that in Australia, which has been a predominant supplier to the Chinese investment story, but we're seeing it here in South Africa, as well as Brazil, Chile, maybe even Canada. So that's #1. We need to acknowledge the global deflationary pressure coming from that transition in China. #2, you have to think about what's happening in technology. Just think of two companies that are prominent here in South Africa, Uber and Airbnb.
Yeah.
The most valuable transportation company on the planet today is Uber. They don't own one car. The most valuable lodging company, hotel company in the world is Airbnb. They don't own one hotel room. We are getting more out of our capital investments, needing less in terms of labor and future capital deployment. That is deflationary as well. Technology is enabling us to do more with less. So that's #2. And then #3, the world's largest economies are all aging. Now, it turns out the fastest growing economies still have some youth underneath them.
They've got a demographic pyramid which looks a little bit like this, a big fat base, and those people could very well grow into an economy if those economies, at the rate of technology, will still support them as they come into the jobs pipeline.
That's right. And the other sort of caveat I would add to your wonderful pyramid, which has historically been a wonderful demographic outlook for future economic growth, is that if you have a base of a pyramid that is too wide because of technology today, you may in fact see GDP per capita fall even as GDP grows. That's not a good dynamic. Demographics are a problem because they're deflationary in the sort of developed world, but they may be a problem in the emerging world because of too many babies being born.
Now, I didn't mention at the beginning, because there's so many things to talk about you, that you're the author of a book called Boom Bustology, which talks about the bubbles, whether it be the tulip bubble with the Dutch, or whether it be the 2008 housing crisis, or whether it be the bubble the commodities bubble that was created through China's massive expansion and then the slowdown in growth in China. Look at the African continent and tell me, from a demographic perspective, with lower growth rates, with softer commodity prices, and with a big fat base of a pyramid, what the outlook is.
Well, let me point at one of South Africa, or one of Africa's largest economies, Nigeria. At current trajectories of birth rates and mortality rates, which we hope will change, but at current trajectories, Nigeria will have close to 1 billion people by the end of this century. That is, for an American in a country that's roughly the size, I think in terms of American states, of Texas. That's a very dense population. So it needs their economy to grow really quickly in order to have GDP per capita grow. I fear that may not be possible. So that's a concerning outlook because it's also a country and a government that's so heavily dependent on oil prices. So that's #1. #2, obviously, it's impossible to talk about commodities, the African continent, and not talk about South Africa. And so when we turn to South Africa and we think about it, or at least how I think about it from a global perspective, is much of what you've seen in South Africa happening today is a symptom of what's been set up in this global context. Unsurprisingly, students that look forward to the future, perhaps with more insight and more care and more worry and more at stake than some of us, are upset because they see the inequality. They see the technology taking away jobs, higher return on capital. They see and feel the deflationary pressure. And I think it's that context in which you see the things like the corruption scandals, you see the student protests, etc., all happen to come out. Those are symptoms of greater problems.
Absolutely, and that's a South African microcosm, but in a place like the United States. I think it was The Economist about 18 months ago that wrote a really interesting piece about global student debt. US student debt sits at $1.5 trillion or thereabouts.
Enormous. Enormous.
The students all over the world have got the same kind of problems, we simply express them differently. Now, Americans may choose to express that point of difference via the ballot box to the anti-establishment character of Donald Trump. How does that change your global view?
Well,
in the unlikely event.
Yeah, well, we don't know. I think we don't know. We had Brexit was unlikely. We had a peace process in Colombia that was likely. We've seen some things that have happened in ways different than prediction markets might have led us to believe. So I'm not ready to pass judgment on the likelihood of Mr. Trump being the next U.S. president. But I think he also is a symptom, again, of this anti-establishment logic. And I think what you're seeing is globalization in retreat. People are turning inward. Again, a world with slower growth. I want to know what's in it for me. Forget about expanding the pie of the global economy. I want our country's share to be larger. And so it suddenly becomes a very provincial, inward-looking, nationalist approach to thinking about economic growth.
Which is fine if you're the United States of America, where you can pick and choose with whom you do business and how you do business. You're the biggest and most powerful economy in the world. Maybe you grow slower, but you can look after yourselves. Europe isn't a spot of bother, but the African continent, which is highly dependent on the business largesse, the global business largesse that exists, and treaties like AGOA, for example, which are massively beneficial to African industry, we've got a lot more to lose in a more parochial world, surely.
I think so, yes. I mean, mainly because less developed countries that were hoping to bank on global markets being available to them are unlikely to see those benefits. So globalization in retreat means less developmental capital flowing to the African continent, I fear. Globalization in retreat means higher tariffs and barriers for African goods entering other markets. Globalization in retreat means technology and skills that might be developed here may not have the markets there.
You've been teaching a course at Yale for the past year or so, part of the course being on bubbles, where you're an expert on economic bubbles, but also you've been teaching a course on inequality. Now, one of the consequences of this changing world is that the inequality gap has to widen. And as those who have get more and those who don't have are excluded more and more.
Yeah, Bruce, I actually think it has a lot to do with what my second theme was at the beginning of our conversation, which is technology and innovation. I hate saying this, I hope I'm wrong, but I fear Karl Marx may have been right. The return on capital is going through the roof. The return on labor is staying stagnant, if not falling. That's not a good dynamic. Ultimately, it causes the 1% to get a lot more and the rest of the world and the working population to get less. Inequality is destined to get worse, not better. That's not a good dynamic.
How do we tackle that?
Well,
you don't want to stymie progress on the one hand. I can't live without Uber. I haven't yet tried Airbnb, but there's some people who won't live without Airbnb anymore either. We want the progress. But one looks at Watson, IBM's Watson, and he scares the living daylights out of me.
Knows everything.
His ability to win, what was the game show?
Jeopardy.
Jeopardy, he won Jeopardy.
Or
it won Jeopardy because he's not a person.
He or she, we're not sure.
It won Jeopardy. We're going to this at huge breakneck speed towards potential calamity, or it's a future of roses. I read a magazine from the 1970s the other day, which told me that by the year 2000, robots would clean our homes and we'd be flying cars to work and landing on helipads at the office. The future isn't always what we make it out to be.
It's not. And I do think you're right to say there's a fork in this road of possible outcomes. One is a future of a utopian society where everyone gets what they need, everyone has every whim satiated. The other is a dystopian dystopian future, which
Mad
is
Max, the Mad Max
the Mad
future.
Max of the world. Yeah, sadly, and I hope we don't go there.
Any guarantees that we won't?
I think that's a tough call. I'm optimistic. I think that technology properly harnessed, appropriately deployed, in a world that thinks of the whole, will be leading us in the direction, hopefully, of utopia.
But the world will no longer think as a whole because you've just told us how fractured we're becoming.
Yes,
and that makes it more dangerous, doesn't it?
It does make it more dangerous, and I think that fracturing, again, the hope, Bruce, is that it's a temporary phenomenon. 3 to 5 years of real difficulty, hardship to endure, and on the other end of it, there's the possibility of, again, resuming growth and resuming inclusion, bringing more people out of poverty, etc.
What is the next catalyst for global growth?
I believe the next catalyst is fiscal stimulus. I think we need to
had 7 or 8 years of that, haven't we?
No, we've had monetary stimulus. We've had monetary
What's the
stimulus. The monetary stimulus is playing with the interest rates, deploying capital into the banking system with the hope that people will lend, or banks will lend, the hope that people will borrow, etc.
And it hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened. So fiscal stimulus is the government takes out a check and actually deploys capital, actually does things.
New Deal style?
Yeah, in the United States, I'm thinking specifically of infrastructure. Yeah. We could rebuild roads, bridges,
Your roads
highways.
in New York are worse than ours in Santon.
Horrible.
You need new roads, you guys.
And a new airport.
Your airports are diabolical.
Oh, they're horrible.
We've overspent on ours. You don't want to do that.
Yeah. No, so I think that type of stuff. Think of what happens. The government builds a road. We have construction workers, we have engineering firms, we have others that are deployed in that process. They have extra income, more jobs. Those workers take those incomes, they go to grocery stores and shopping, etc., which then can employ more people. It snowballs through.
But we have to go through a period of deep dislocation before we get there.
We don't have to go through that deep a dislocation, Bruce, right? I mean, government has the ability, at least in some of the developed world, they have the ability to spend. They do have the ability to spend. I mean, we can get into a separate discussion of borrowing money.
$152 trillion
worth of
just
about
debt.
to talk about the debt
Yes.
problem. Yes, you can borrow a lot of money and spend a lot of money. So yes, there's a debt problem. But you do need to do something about growth. Global growth is stalling. We are at a stage where that is causing lots of problems. I would argue to you, and my suspicion is you might agree, that if the South African economic outlook were rosier, if we could see 3, 5, 7, 10% growth in South Africa, we wouldn't be having the concerns and the issues that are plaguing the newspapers every day in South Africa of this corruption scandal, these students being upset, etc., etc.
Dr. Vikram Mancharamani, the former senior Harvard University fellow, president of Keelan Advisors, and so much more as well. But most of all, and where if you want to get more insight into the way he thinks, buy his book, Boom-Bustology. Boom-Bustology. It flows off the tongue really nicely. More thinking on and issues to digest on the future on the next Moneymakers. Thank you so much for watching. Vikram, nice to see you as well.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching. Good night.
Thanks.